Happy Halloween, everybody. Okay, so now that that's over, um, when does the individual become part of the collective, and what needs to happen for that to actually become part of the cultural currency? Excuse me, part of the cultural currency that's associated with those actions. In other words, when an artist joins into a communally authored practice, what does that mean, and how does it affect our understanding of those practices? Excuse me, got something in my throat. Um, so what I was saying was, what does it mean when these people exist as one mass? How do we engage with that? Now, to fully understand this, you can look at the work that Grant Kester pulls out, which makes a lot of sense, but I think it's going to be helpful to go back one step and really look at it from the perspective of the West. Because within Western culture, the idea of the individual is so much more privileged than it is in other places, specifically with regard to cultural practice. In the West, we have lots of different conversations that can be had about who this person is in relationship to who these people are. Is this person the kind of crazy romantic artist that doesn't fit into bourgeois society, a la Vincent van Gogh or Paul Gauguin, and this being that bourgeois society that they don't fit into? Or is this Vasily Kandinsky, and does he think of himself as the avant-garde who is pulling all of these people forward and is personally responsible for the enculturation of this mass group of people? Or is this person Jackson Pollock or the other, fabled bad boys of American art who has reckless behavior but exists to in a lot of ways, it is kind of the same thing as Vasily Kandinsky, but I think there's actually a certain level of entertainment. People were really interested in the life and story of Jackson Pollock more so than they were interested in the life and story of Vasily Kandinsky because of the way that the media worked and how they actually presented his image to the world. But that's a story for another time. What we are talking about today is what happens when you invert these two roles? What happens when the individual artist or all of those ideas, the outsider, unfit for bourgeois culture, responsible for pulling the community forward, becomes part of the masses, even a small group of masses? Well, how does that change their relationship to the audience and to the people that they're working within and to the individual artists that exist in the world around them? So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about what goes on outside of the Western world. In lots and lots of cultural workshops throughout the world, there are small communities of people that come together to make things. This happens in the West for certain. There are people that go to work and, they make tie-dye, or they make beaded necklaces, or they do something. These kinds of cultural productions happen in the United States. But outside the U.S., there is not this sense that there's a difference between the individual artist and the person who works in the workshop. And I'm showing you a picture of Western African women who are doing a process that's referred to as adire fabric dyeing, A-D-I-R-E. Now, adire dyeing is a form of, it's basically their term for indigo dyeing. But it's not just the actual adding of pigment to textile. What happens in those instances is they're adding a certain level of cultural value that makes those fabrics, the fabrics that they're dyeing, stand in for both social value but also monetary value. If you have very saturated indigo dyed garments on, you are seen to be of the upper echelon within these given societies. And you can see two instances of these fabrics adorning two of the women here. This is being one of them, and this being the other. These objects are probably dyed, but you can see that they're just kind of singular tones and not necessarily any kind of pattern. The heightening of the pattern, the deeper the indigo, the more quote-unquote value is put into these things. But that's another conversation for another time. What's interesting for us today is looking at the way that these people come together and just make things. They make things that are valuable for the culture that they are living within, and it is, they're making things that are also expressive. These patterns are, there's a tradition that goes into them, but there is a certain level of artistic prowess that is lorded over it in these workshops. My assumption here, given that this woman appears to be the eldest, is that she is the matriarch of this dyeing operation, with this woman here who is actually manning the indigo bucket being her second in command. And then here we have people who are learning the trade, but ultimately this woman is not going to be the identifier for all of the cloth that comes out of this workshop. It just comes out of this community. It doesn't come from a specific person. The cultural production, even though it does not touch the hands of everybody in the community, it is still part of the voice of that community. That voice is it's rooted so deeply in the community that people, there's no disassociation there. To better understand collective practice and how it really takes hold in the U.S., we need to look at this kind of stuff again. Basically, what we have here is Hugo Ball performing Caravane at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in around 1915, 1916. What the Dadaists did in Zurich when they massed together was similar to what these clothing workshops were doing, but much more westernized. These people, divorced from their national communities outside of their nation states, very much flaunting the fact that they are individuals, they came together as a group and put down that individual identity and picked up a group identity. And they also actually picked up masks of the likenesses of other people in the group so as to trade identities. They picked up false languages to emulate the cacophony of different tongues that are being spoken in this small European capital during this short World War I period. And so basically everything that they were doing in Zurich can be read as an examination of individual identity versus the collective identity. What happens when a group of people decide that the single tenet of national pride that is defined as the individual who is German within a German community, or the individual who is French within a French community, if that becomes the main source of their questioning, of their mining, as it were, for artistic resources, then they become the grandfathers of collective practice within the Western world. They really challenge how creative producers engage with their community. These people did it the old-fashioned way. They did it the way that Paul Gauguin did, where he left bourgeois society and established a certain, although misunderstood, sense of aesthetic values when he moved to Breton, then farther to Tahiti. What these guys did is the same thing, but they didn't move quite as far. They left their national identities behind and came to this place where they could just be universal people, they could be humans in a group, and they could avoid being individual authors. The next step from there leads us to this group of people who in France in 1957 collected under the name of the Situationists Internationale. Now, the Situationists are born out of radicalized political rhetoric. The kinds of things that they produce are not radicalized and are not that political. But it is very important to understand that the collection of people here comes from meeting groups that were based on basically socialist ideals. A group of people were publishing newsletters and meeting under the name of the Lettrists International, or the Lettrists International. When a group of these Lettrists were denied access to a meeting because of a fault between members of the community, they decided to coalesce under another heading, and they became the Situationists Internationale. And they're led primarily by one person here, although I don't want to privilege his perspective over all of these other people at the table. Because the fact of the matter is, these people are not seen as Guy Debord's studio assistants. This is Guy Debord. These people are seen as his collaborators. He views them out on equal footing with himself, and their ideas shared around a table like this or a situation like this are all valuable in the same. Now this goes back to, Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings founded, quote unquote, the Cabaret Voltaire, but they weren't the only people performing in the first show and the last show. They weren't the only people who were postering Zurich to try and get people to come to this show. Instead, they were just the people that went first to the cabaret and asked them if they could host an event there. And it was just that action that gives us the historical perspective that they founded it, quote unquote, when really it's a group effort, and those kinds of historical narratives don't do the actual event in Zurich in 1916 any justice. And in the same way here, Guy Debord is given a lot of credit for being the kind of main guy behind the Situationists Internationale. That's just because he wrote the most. There's actually a few writings of his. I think there's at least one writing, there might be two, in the Art and Theory book by Guy Debord on the derive and the determine, which are his two methods for basically getting people to acknowledge where the Situationists are coming from. And ideologically, they're coming from a similar place as Tristan Tzara and, primarily Tristan Tzara, who proclaimed, as I said over the summer, that for art to be, or for culture to be viable, it really actually needs to be you need to be it takes the actions of the idiot. Remember how I said that over the summer? That you need to be purely idiotic, because to not be idiotic, to be smart, or to be part of the gentry is to be part of the machine that led to the First World War. And so at the First World War, Tristan Tzara said, okay, progress did not do us justice, so we actually need to become a little more idiotic and a little more just kind of like, let's test the boundaries. And this goes back to a lot of conversations I've had with all of you in studio, but also in lecture, about how play is really a wildly important thing. Guy Debord was really interested in getting people to break from their bourgeois routine through a variety of different exercises so as they could increase their ability to critically examine their perspective within the community, within bourgeois culture, which is largely seen as the umbrella for all of, for everything that these guys are interacting with. The program that I'm using to record these lectures caps them off at 15 minutes. So this is going to be part 1. Look for part 2 immediately below.